The dog was supposed to attack on command. Instead, it sat down in the middle of the driveway and stared at the sky like it had forgotten why it existed. Gideon Sterling watched from the top step of his estate, arms crossed, jaw tight enough to crack. Behind him, 4 more of his prized guard dogs paced in tight, nervous circles, ignoring every signal his handlers gave. One of them had bitten a guard that morning. Not an intruder, a guard, someone the dog had known for 2 years. Another had refused to eat for 3 days straight. This was not a dog problem. Gideon knew that. This was his problem, leaking out through 6 terrified animals who lived on an estate where nobody, including the man who owned it, had slept properly in months. Gideon Sterling ran cargo through half the ports on the Pacific coast, and everyone who mattered on either side of the law knew his name meant something you did not test twice. He'd built an empire on precision, ships that left on time, debts that got collected quietly, enemies who disappeared without headlines. Precision required control, and right now, standing on his own porch, he had none. "Find someone," he told his head of security, a broad man named Reyes, who had never once seen his boss look this exhausted. "Today. I don't care what it costs." Reyes came back 4 hours later with a name Gideon had never heard, Brenna Hollis. No syndicate ties, no corporate polish, just a woman who ran a rescue shelter 2 hours south and had a reputation among ranchers and canine units alike for fixing dogs nobody else could touch. She arrived at 6 that evening in a truck that had seen better decades, wearing mud-caked boots and a rain jacket 2 sizes too big, hauling a duffel bag of gear over one shoulder like it weighed nothing. Gideon's guards straightened instinctively. Everyone straightened when Gideon Sterling walked toward them. Brenna didn't even look up. "You're crowding them," she said, not to Reyes, not to anyone in particular, just into the air, like a fact too obvious to aim at a person. Then she noticed the man in the tailored coat stepping closer with 2 armed men flanking him, and she still didn't look up. "That includes you, especially you." Gideon stopped walking. Nobody spoke to him like that. Not board members, not rival bosses, not the men who owed him money and feared him more than prison. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, and even as the words left his mouth, he heard how tired they sounded, how far from menacing. Brenna finally lifted her eyes to his, steady, unimpressed, entirely unafraid, and something in his chest turned over in a way he didn't have a name for. "I know you're the reason these dogs can't breathe right," she said. She held out a heavy leash without ceremony. "Take this. Stand 10 feet back. Don't talk. Don't move fast. If you can manage that for 20 minutes, we'll see if there's anything left to fix." For 3 full seconds, nobody in the yard breathed. Reyes's hand drifted, almost involuntarily, toward his hip. One of the younger guards actually gasped. Gideon took the leash. He didn't understand why. Later, lying awake at 3 a.m. as he did most nights, he would try to explain it to himself, that he was testing her, that he wanted to see how a woman with nothing to lose would handle real power up close. But the truth, the one he wouldn't admit for weeks, was simpler than that. Nobody had spoken to him like a person in longer than he could remember. Every word aimed his way came wrapped in fear or flattery, calculated to please the man who could ruin a life with one phone call. Brenna hadn't calculated anything. She'd just told him the truth and handed him a leash. He stood back. He stayed quiet. He watched her move through his pack of half-feral guard dogs with a calm that had nothing to do with training techniques and everything to do with something in her that simply didn't panic, not around dangerous animals, and clearly not around dangerous men either. 20 minutes later, the dog that had bitten a guard that morning was lying on its side in the gravel, letting Brenna scratch its ribs, tail thumping against the ground for the first time in a week. "They're not broken," Brenna said, finally standing, wiping her hands on her jeans. "They're mirroring you. Every one of them is walking around scared because the man at the top of their pack is falling apart, and dogs know that before people do. She slung her bag back over her shoulder, already walking toward her truck. "I'll be back Wednesday, 6 a.m. Don't be late, Mr. Sterling. And lose the guards next time. They're not helping." She drove off without waiting for a response, tires crunching gravel, taillights disappearing down the long coastal driveway. Gideon stood there a long time, the leash still looped around his fist, staring after a woman who had walked onto his estate, disarmed 6 trained attack dogs and 1 armed crime boss, and left without so much as learning his first name. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he found himself looking forward to Wednesday. Wednesday came, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Gideon Sterling woke up before his alarm without needing it. Brenna's truck rolled up the long gravel drive at exactly 5:58 a.m., headlights cutting through fog that hadn't lifted off the Pine Ridge yet. Gideon was already on the porch, dressed down in a plain jacket instead of his usual tailored coat, a mug of black coffee going cold in his hand because he hadn't trusted himself to drink it, not with his hands shaking the way they'd been shaking most mornings lately. "You're actually up," Brenna said, climbing out of the truck with a bag of gear and, oddly, a second thermos. "I half expected to find you still asleep and a guard lying to me about it." "I don't sleep," Gideon said. It came out flatter than he meant it to, more confession than complaint. Brenna studied him for a second, not the polite, careful once-over people gave him when they were afraid of saying the wrong thing, but a real, appraising look, the kind she probably gave a dog she was trying to diagnose. "Yeah," she said. "I figured." She didn't ask why. She didn't offer sympathy either, the way women in his world did when they wanted something from him, a favor, a foothold, a ring on their finger. She just handed him the second thermos, already poured, and said, "Drink that instead. Coffee that's gone cold isn't coffee anymore. It's punishment." He almost laughed. He couldn't remember the last time that had happened either. The reconditioning schedule Brenna laid out was strict and, as far as Gideon could tell, largely built around him. Every morning at dawn, he was to walk the estate's pine forest trail with 2 of the dogs, no phone, no guards, no talking on the radio to check in with his men. "They need to see you calm and boring," she told him flatly on that first walk, boots crunching over wet needles. "Not powerful, not scary. Boring. Predictable. That's what makes them feel safe." "Nobody's ever called me boring," Gideon said. "There's a first time for everything, Mr. Sterling." He noticed, over those first mornings, how differently she moved through the world than everyone else who orbited him. The women in his circle, investors' daughters, rival bosses' nieces, the occasional actress paraded through galas by men hoping to curry favor, treated every interaction with him like a performance. They laughed at things that weren't funny. They dressed to be noticed, then dressed differently the next time if the first outfit hadn't landed the way they wanted. They agreed with him before he'd finished a sentence.
Brenna ate a hard-boiled egg out of a paper towel on his porch steps like it was the most natural thing in the world, crumbs and all, and told him, without him asking, that his shoulders were too tense and it was making the dogs read him as a threat instead of a leader. "You carry yourself like you're bracing for a hit," she said on the 3rd morning, handing him half of a homemade breakfast sandwich without asking if he wanted it. "All the time, even sitting still." "I run a business where people occasionally try to hit me," Gideon said. "It's a reasonable habit." "Sure, but the dogs don't know that. All they see is a man who's never relaxed once in his life, and it makes them think something's coming." She took a bite of her own sandwich, chewing thoughtfully, entirely unbothered by the silence that followed. "When's the last time nothing was coming? Just for you. No deal, no threat, no fire to put out." Gideon opened his mouth to answer and found he genuinely didn't know. He searched for a year, a season, even a single week, and came up empty. The realization sat in his chest like something cold and unfamiliar. Brenna didn't press him on it. She just nodded, like his silence was answer enough, and changed the subject to how the dog nearest them, a lean shepherd named Duke, needed to stop associating the sound of raised voices with punishment. It became a ritual faster than Gideon wanted to admit. He started waking without the alarm, lying in the dark for a few minutes, just anticipating the crunch of her tires on the gravel. He found himself thinking about the porch conversations during meetings he should have been fully present for, replaying some offhand thing she'd said about a dog's ears, or the way storms made animals anxious hours before the first thunder, as if there were a code hidden in it, meant specifically for him. By the second week, Reyes noticed. He said nothing directly, but Gideon caught him watching from the upstairs window one dawn, arms crossed, an expression on his face that Gideon didn't like being read by anyone, least of all his own head of security. "Something to say?" Gideon asked him afterward, in the kitchen, coffee cups between them. "You're different in the mornings," Reyes said carefully. "Calmer. Is that a problem?" "No," Reyes hesitated. "Just new." Words starting to move through the estate. People notice when the boss stops looking like he's about to snap. Gideon didn't answer that. He didn't want to examine too closely what it meant that a woman with mud on her boots and no fear of armed men had done in 9 days what therapists, doctors, and a small fortune in prescriptions had failed to do in 3 years. What he didn't tell Reyes, what he barely admitted to himself, sitting on the porch steps on the 9th morning, Brenna beside him, half asleep against a support beam, with a coffee going cold in her hand for once, instead of his, was that he had started to dread the days she wasn't scheduled to come. He watched her now, instead of watching the tree line for threats. She had a scar along one knuckle from a dog bite years ago that she talked about like it was nothing, like getting hurt doing work she loved was simply the cost of it. She hummed off-key when she thought he wasn't paying attention. She never once asked him what he did for a living beyond something with ships, and never once seemed to care about the answer. For a man who had spent 15 years being valued only for what he could provide, protection, money, fear, favors, her indifference to all of it felt less like an insult and more like the first honest air he'd breathed in years. He didn't have a word yet for what was building in his chest on that porch, watching fog burn off the pine ridge while a woman who wanted nothing from him drank his coffee and told his dogs, without irony, that they were doing a good job. But he suspected, uneasily, that he was about to find out.
10 days into the new routine, Brenna missed a morning without calling to explain, and Gideon noticed how unreasonably unsettled that made him. He told himself it was about the dogs, that consistency mattered for their training, that a broken schedule would undo 2 weeks of progress. It was a lie he didn't examine too closely. By mid-morning, he'd had Reyes track down her clinic's address, and by early afternoon he was driving there himself, alone, a forgotten leash and training clicker sitting on the passenger seat as his excuse. Tillamook Valley sat 2 hours south of his estate, a stretch of green farmland and fog-draped hills that felt like another country compared to the cold precision of his coastline. Brenna's rescue shelter was smaller than he'd expected, a converted barn, a scatter of chain-link kennels, a hand-painted sign reading Hollis Animal Rescue that had clearly been repainted more than once. It was modest in a way nothing in his life was modest. He liked it immediately and didn't know what to do with that. He heard the argument before he saw it. "You can't just decide my zoning is invalid because it's inconvenient for your client," Brenna was saying, her voice sharp and controlled in a way Gideon hadn't heard from her yet. She stood at the gate, arms crossed, facing down a man in an expensive gray suit
who looked deeply out of place, holding a clipboard in the middle of a gravel lot full of barking dogs. "Ms. Hollis, I'm simply relaying what the county has flagged," the man said, in the practiced tone of someone used to talking people out of things they were legally entitled to. "Noise ordinance violations, waste runoff concerns, structural code issues on that barn. Any one of these could result in nothing because none of it's true and we both know it," Brenna cut in. "This land's been zoned agricultural use for 40 years. My lease is current. My permits are current. This isn't a code review, Mr. Danvers. It's a shakedown dressed up in a clipboard." Danvers's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes flickered, irritation at being read correctly. "My client, Coastview Development, is prepared to offer a generous relocation buyout. $20,000 effective immediately, no further zoning action pursued." $20,000 doesn't relocate 40 dogs, 6 goats, and a barn owl with 1 wing, Brenna said flatly. "And even if it did, I'm not selling. Tell your client that Tillamook County keeps very good records, and I intend to make copies of every single one of these violations public before his resort breaks ground on wetlands that were never surveyed properly to begin with." Danvers's jaw tightened. He noticed Gideon then, standing near the gate in a dark coat that looked entirely wrong for a farm, and something in his posture changed, the way men in expensive suits instinctively recalibrated around money and danger they couldn't quite place. He said nothing more, gathered his clipboard, and retreated to a black sedan parked at an angle that suggested he hadn't planned on staying long. Once the car pulled away down the gravel road, Brenna exhaled hard and turned to find Gideon watching her. "You following me now, Mr. Sterling?" "You forgot this," he said, holding up the leash like it explained a 2-hour drive. She almost smiled. Almost. "I have 4 of those." "I know." He set it on the gatepost anyway. "Who was that?" Brenna's shoulders dropped a fraction, exhaustion showing through the sharpness for the first time. "Coastview Development, backed by some investor nobody in the county's ever met in person. They want this valley for a resort, golf course, spa, the works. My lease is standing between them and 40 acres of waterfront they can't touch otherwise." She kicked at the gravel.
"They've been finding creative reasons to condemn my barn for 3 months. Gideon felt something cold and familiar settle into his chest, the specific stillness that came right before he made a decision that ended badly for whoever was on the other side of it. "Give me a name," he said. "The investor. I can make this go away by Friday." Brenna looked at him then, really looked, and whatever warmth had been building on those porch mornings cooled several degrees. "Make it go away how?" "However it needs to go away." "That's what I thought." She shook her head, more disappointed than angry, which somehow landed harder. "No." "Brenna, I said no." She said it plainly, without theatrics, the same tone she used telling a nervous dog to sit. "I don't need a crime lord fixing my problems with methods I don't want to know about. I fight my battles in daylight, through lawyers and county records and public hearings, because that's the only kind of winning that doesn't cost me something I can't get back. If I let you handle this your way, I don't own this place anymore. You do, just quietly, with better paperwork." It stung more than he expected, mostly because she wasn't wrong. He'd spent his whole life buying loyalty and solving problems with leverage, and it had never once occurred to him that a solution could be refused on principle rather than price. "I wasn't trying to buy you," he said quietly. "I know." Her voice softened slightly, though she didn't back down an inch. "That's not the point. The point is, I don't owe anybody anything for this place. Not the county, not Coastview, and not you. The day I do, it stops being mine." Gideon nodded slowly, filing away a lesson he'd never had cause to learn before.
that some people valued what they'd built with their own hands more than they valued having it protected by someone else's power. "I'll leave the offer open," he said finally, "in case you change your mind." "I won't." But she said it without heat this time, and when she glanced toward her truck and then back at him, there was something almost like gratitude buried under the stubbornness. "Come see the barn owl before you drive back. She likes visitors who don't try to fix her wing before she's ready." Gideon followed her across the gravel lot, past kennels of barking dogs who'd already, somehow, stopped barking at him specifically, and understood, with the same cold clarity he usually reserved for reading a business rival, that he had just met the first person in 15 years he couldn't buy, threaten, or outmaneuver into needing him. He wasn't sure yet whether that terrified him or was the reason he couldn't stop driving south. The storm rolled in off the Pacific just after 9, the kind of coastal system that turned the sky the color of wet slate and knocked branches loose from trees that had stood through 100 storms before it. By 10, the power had failed across the entire estate, plunging the main house and the kennels into a darkness broken only by emergency lanterns and the occasional flicker of a generator that hadn't quite caught yet. Gideon told Reyes he'd handled the kennels himself. It wasn't strictly true. There were men on staff paid specifically for maintenance, but something in him needed the work, needed his hands doing something simple and physical, while the wind screamed against the estate's windows like it was trying to get in. He found the loose door on the 3rd kennel, a bent hinge rattling every time the wind gusted, and knelt in the dark with a flashlight wedged under his chin, trying to force a screw into wood that had swollen with rain. The dogs around him were restless, pacing, whining low in their throats at the thunder rolling in off the water. He didn't notice his hands were shaking until he dropped the screwdriver twice in a row. It came on the way it always did, sudden, without warning, like a trap door opening under him. His chest seized.
The air in the kennel felt thinner, wrong, like there wasn't enough of it left for both him and the storm outside. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard it felt like a physical blow, and somewhere underneath the panic, a colder, more familiar voice reminded him that men like him didn't get to fall apart, that there were people counting on him to be unbreakable, that weakness in his position wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. He sank down against the kennel wall, flashlight rolling out of his grip, and pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum as if he could physically hold himself together. He didn't hear Brenna's truck over the wind. He didn't hear her boots on the gravel, or the kennel door swinging open, or anything at all until she was crouching in front of him, rain dripping off her jacket, her voice cutting through the roar in his ears with the same flat, unhurried certainty she used on frightened animals. "Hey, look at me." He couldn't. His eyes were fixed somewhere past her shoulder, on nothing, on everything. "Gideon." His first name. She'd never used it before. Something about hearing it, plain and steady, cut through the panic just enough for him to focus on the sound of her voice instead of the roaring in his own head. "You're not dying. I know it feels like it. You're not." She didn't touch him right away, didn't crowd him the way his instincts screamed someone would, didn't call for help or reach for her phone or treat him like a problem to be managed. She simply sat down in the straw beside him, close enough that her shoulder nearly touched his, and stayed there. "Duke," she said quietly, and the shepherd, the same dog who'd once bitten a guard, who now trusted her completely, padded over and lay down, resting his heavy head across Gideon's lap without being asked twice. The weight of it, warm and solid, and entirely uncomplicated, did something the panic hadn't accounted for. Gideon's hand moved to the dog's fur almost on its own, and the simple, repetitive motion, fur, warmth, breath rising and falling under his palm, gave his racing mind something to hold on to besides the spiraling certainty that he was coming apart. "Talk to me about something boring," Brenna said, settling in like she had nowhere else to be.
like the storm wasn't still tearing at the world outside. Not the ships, not the business, something with no weight to it at all. I don't. His voice cracked. He hated how young it sounded. I don't know what that would even be. Then I'll start. Her voice stayed level, unbothered, a steady line he could follow out of the dark. I hate the smell of wet dog. Everyone assumes I love it because of what I do. I don't. I've just made peace with it being permanent. She reached over, not for him exactly, just resting her hand near his on Duke's back, close enough that the warmth of it registered even through the panic. Your turn. Something small. It took him 3 tries to get words out that weren't about the storm, or the estate, or the men currently securing his perimeter in the dark. I like the sound my coffee maker makes, he finally managed, absurdly. Every morning, same sound. It's the only thing in my day that's exactly the same as yesterday. See? Brenna said softly. That wasn't so hard. They stayed like that for a long time, the storm easing gradually outside, the lantern light throwing soft gold across the straw, Duke's steady breathing under Gideon's hand, Brenna's voice filling the space with nothing important at all, exactly the way he'd needed. His pulse slowed by degrees he couldn't have charted if asked. The trapdoor closed. The air came back. He didn't tell her how long it had been since anyone had witnessed him like this. Not weak in a way that could be exploited, not vulnerable in a way that demanded he apologize for it afterward. Just human, sitting on the ground in a kennel with a dog on his lap and rain in his hair. He suspected she already understood that without being told, the way she seemed to understand most things about him faster than he understood them himself. Somewhere in the low lantern light, watching her lean back against the kennel wall beside him, unbothered by the mud on her jeans or the dog hair on her jacket, or the fact that the most feared man on the Oregon coast had just had a panic attack in front of her, Gideon Sterling understood, with a clarity sharper than anything he'd felt in years, that he had fallen in love with her. Not with her fearlessness, though that had drawn him first. Not with the way she'd disarmed his guard dogs on day 1, or refused his money, or told him the truth without flinching. He had fallen for the specific, ordinary grace of a woman who could sit beside a broken man in the dark and simply stay, asking nothing, offering everything, as though comfort didn't need to be complicated to be real. "Feeling steadier?" she asked eventually, when the storm outside had softened to a drizzle and the lantern had begun to gutter low. "Yeah," Gideon said, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, it was true. Word of what happened in the kennel never left the estate. Gideon made sure of that. Not out of shame exactly, though there was some of that too, but because a story about the boss falling apart in a storm was the kind of thing that traveled fast in his world and got twisted into a weapon by the time it reached the wrong ears. He didn't know, in the days after, that one set of those wrong ears already belonged to someone on his own payroll. Marcus Voss had been with the organization for 11 years, long enough to have earned a lieutenant's title and a corner office at the port facility, long enough to believe, quietly, resentfully, that he deserved more of both. He'd watched Gideon's recent softness with a mixture of contempt and opportunity. A boss who cancelled meetings to walk dogs at dawn. A boss who let an outsider with mud on her boots wander the estate unsupervised. A boss, Voss had started telling a small circle of loyal men over drinks, who was losing his grip. It wasn't hard to convince himself the timing was a gift. Brenna arrived at the estate Thursday evening later than usual, delayed by a difficult delivery at the shelter, her service van loaded with training equipment and 2 crates of supplies she planned to drop off before heading home. She parked in her usual spot near the side gate, out of habit rather than instruction, close enough to the equipment shed that most of the staff had stopped questioning why her van sat there unattended for stretches at a time. Nobody thought twice about a rescue worker's beat-up van. That, Voss had decided, was exactly the point. He waited until the estate's evening rotation thinned, until Reyes was occupied at the main gate and the dogs, Brenna's dogs now, more than anyone else's, were fed and settled for the night. He moved toward the van with a duffel bag under his arm, confident in the kind of quiet a man gets used to when he's spent a decade being trusted. He didn't account for Duke. The shepherd caught his scent from 30 yards off, a low growl building before Voss had even reached the van door. 2 more dogs picked it up seconds later, their bodies going rigid, ears forward, the specific alert bark Brenna had spent weeks training into them for exactly this. Not for strangers, not for noise, but for wrongness. Voss froze, cursing under his breath, and made the mistake of thinking he had a few more seconds than he actually did. Brenna came around the corner of the equipment shed at a jog, drawn by the barking, and stopped cold at the sight of a man she recognized from staff meetings, crouched at the back doors of her van, with a duffel bag half unzipped, several sealed packages visible inside that had absolutely nothing to do with dog food. For one suspended second, neither of them moved.
Then Brenna did something Voss hadn't planned for at all. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She pulled her phone out of her jacket pocket in one smooth motion and started taking photographs. The open van doors, the duffel bag, the packages, Voss's face turned half toward her in the porch floodlight, caught mid-motion with nowhere to go. "Put that down," Voss said, low and urgent, stepping toward her. "I don't think so." Brenna kept the phone raised, backing a step toward the dogs rather than away from them, which threw him further off balance than anything else she could have done. "You want to explain to me why there's unmarked product in my van, or should I let Gideon ask you that instead?" Something in Voss's face shifted, calculation curdling into panic. He was a man who'd built his entire plan around Brenna being an outsider too naive to notice, and instead found himself facing a woman who'd spent years reading danger off animals faster than most people read it off other humans, and who clearly wasn't going to be talked out of what she'd just seen. He made a grab for the phone. Duke closed the distance between them before his hand got close, 110 pounds of trained muscle putting itself squarely between Voss and Brenna without needing to be told, teeth bared, low growl rising into something far more serious. Voss backed off, hands raised, and by the time 2 of the estate's other guards came around the shed, drawn by the barking, he'd already abandoned the duffel bag on the gravel and was walking fast toward the main house with the particular stiffness of a man trying very hard to look like nothing had happened. Brenna didn't chase him. She didn't need to. She walked straight into the main house, past a startled housekeeper, past Reyes's raised eyebrows in the hallway, and found Gideon in his private study reviewing shipping manifests by lamplight. She set her phone down on the desk between them, screen still lit, photographs displayed in a neat row. "Your lieutenant just tried to plant something in my van," she said, without preamble, without drama, the same flat certainty she used correcting a dog's bad habit. "I'm guessing so it'd look like I was running product through your estate. Which, I assume, would have ended badly for both of us. You for trusting an outsider with access, and me for existing near your business at all." Gideon went very still. The kind of stillness Reyes recognized from years of working under him. Not calm, but the eye of something about to move very fast. "Voss," he said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know his name. Tall, gray at the temples. Was in the staff meeting Tuesday, standing near the door." "That's Voss." Gideon's jaw tightened as he scrolled through the photos, each one landing like confirmation of a suspicion he hadn't let himself examine closely enough. Voss, unhappy for months. Voss, passed over for a larger territory in the spring. Voss, exactly the kind of man who'd see Gideon's recent changes as weakness rather than what they actually were. "He would have ruined you," Gideon said quietly, looking up at her, "and used my own operation to do it." "He tried," Brenna corrected. "Emphasis on tried. Your dogs did their job." She crossed her arms, watching him carefully, some of the fire from the confrontation still burning behind her eyes. "This is exactly the kind of thing I told you I didn't want you handling with bullets and threats. Handle it properly. Use what's actually true."
Gideon looked at the photographs one more time, then at her. Muddy boots, rain jacket, phone held out like evidence in a courtroom rather than a confession pulled from someone under duress, and felt something settle into place that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with certainty. "I will," he said. "I promise you that." For the first time since she'd walked into that study, Brenna allowed herself the smallest, tightest smile. "Good," she said. "Now go feed your dogs." They had a rough night, too. The Municipal Land Board scheduled Brenna's hearing for the following Monday, a date that had been sitting on her kitchen calendar for weeks, circled in red, underlined twice. She'd planned to drive up alone in her truck, armed with a binder of permits and a folder of county records thick enough to double as a doorstop. Gideon showed up at her gate at 6 that morning instead, in a plain black car with no security detail trailing behind it, and told her he was driving. "I can drive myself," Brenna said, arms crossed in the doorway of her barn, though there was less bite in it than there would have been a month earlier. "I know you can." Gideon leaned against the car, hands in his pockets, patient in a way that had become new for him. "I'm not offering because I think you can't. I'm offering because it's a 3-hour drive, and I'd rather spend it talking to you than sitting in a boardroom pretending to read reports I've already memorized." She studied him for a long moment, long enough that he wondered if she was going to send him back down the driveway the way she had the last time he'd offered to fix her problems for her. Then she sighed, grabbed her binder off the porch step, and got in the car. The drive up the coast highway unspooled, slow and grey, fog sitting low over the water, the road curving through stands of pine that opened occasionally onto long views of the Pacific churning against the rocks below. For the first hour, they talked about nothing important. Duke's improving temperament, the barn owl's slowly healing wing, a diner near the county line that made biscuits Brenna swore by. It was easy in a way conversation with Gideon had never been with anyone else in his life, and he found himself, somewhere past the second hour, asking the question he'd been circling since the storm in the kennel. "Who taught you not to be afraid of men like me?" Brenna was quiet for a moment, watching the trees blur past the window. "Nobody taught me not to be afraid," she said finally. "I learned it the hard way, same as most things." She told him about Marcus, a different Marcus than the one who'd tried to ruin her at the estate, a corporate executive she'd been engaged to for 2 years in her late 20s, a man with a good job and better manners in public, and none at all behind closed doors. He'd hated her body long before he ever said so directly, she told him, hated it in small ways first. Comments about portions at dinner, jokes at parties that weren't jokes, a running suggestion that she'd be prettier, more presentable, more worthy of the life he was offering her if she just tried harder. He'd wanted her smaller in every sense of the word, quieter opinions, smaller ambitions, a body that took up less space in photographs with his colleagues. "He didn't want a partner," Brenna said, voice level in the way she got when she was working hard to keep it that way. "He wanted an accessory he could shape into whatever made him look best. And for a long time, I let him try, because I thought that was what love was supposed to cost." She turned to look at Gideon directly for the first time since starting the story. "I left 2 months before the wedding, rebuilt the shelter from nothing that same year. It was the best decision I ever made, and also the loneliest one, for a while." Gideon kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel, though something in his chest had gone tight and furious on her behalf, a feeling he recognized from every other time in his life he'd wanted to make someone disappear. "I'm not going to pretend I understand what that cost you," he said carefully, "but I understand wanting to shrink yourself so someone with power over you stays happy. I've built a career on making people feel small enough to need me." The admission cost him something to say out loud, and he said it anyway. "I never want you to feel like that around me." "Not for a second." "You haven't," Brenna said, and it landed with more weight than either of them expected, sitting in the quiet after it, like something newly built between them. "That's actually the strange part. You're the most powerful man I've ever met, and you're the first one who's never once tried to make me smaller, to make yourself feel bigger." "I couldn't if I wanted to," Gideon said.
You'd just tell me to lose the guards and stand 10 feet back. That got the first real laugh out of her all morning, unguarded and bright, and something loosened in his chest at the sound of it. Proof that the weight of what she'd carried into the car with her hadn't followed her all the way to Portland. They drove on, and the conversation shifted lighter again, but the shape of what had passed between them stayed present under everything else they said. Gideon found himself replaying her words, the first one who's never once tried to make me smaller, turning them over like something he needed to earn the right to keep. He understood, somewhere past mile marker 60, that he'd spent his entire adult life mistaking control for love, protection for affection, the ability to fix a problem for the right to be trusted with one. Brenna had never asked him to fix anything that was hers to fix. She'd only ever asked him to stand back, stay honest, and let her be exactly as much as she already was. It occurred to him, watching her flip absently through her binder of permits as the city skyline finally rose out of the fog ahead of them, that her independence, the very quality that had first unsettled him, standing on his own porch weeks earlier, being told to stand down by a stranger in muddy boots, wasn't something he needed to overcome or manage. It was the thing that had saved him. It was the reason he was, for the first time in years, driving toward a fight that wasn't his and choosing to bring nothing but himself into it. "Nervous?" he asked as they merged onto the downtown exit, tall glass buildings swallowing the grey morning light. "A little." Brenna closed the binder, squaring it on her lap like armor. "But I've survived worse rooms than a land board hearing." Gideon glanced at her, at the steady set of her jaw, the same fearlessness that had first pulled him toward her weeks ago in a driveway full of frightened dogs, and felt something settle firmly into place inside his chest. "So have I," he said quietly. "Let's go survive this one too." The municipal land board hearing room was smaller than Brenna had expected, all fluorescent light and worn carpet, a horseshoe of folding tables where 5 board members sat flipping through binders nearly identical to hers. She'd been in rooms like this before, small, unglamorous, entirely unequipped for the size of what got decided inside them. Land, livelihoods, whether 40 rescued animals had a home next month or didn't. Gideon sat 3 rows back, alone, no coat this time, no visible reminder of who he was to anyone who didn't already know. He'd told her before they walked in that he'd stay quiet unless she needed him, and so far he'd kept that promise, watching the proceedings with the same unreadable stillness he brought to every negotiation that actually mattered to him. Coastview Development had sent 2 lawyers instead of 1 this time, both sharper dressed than Danvers had been at the gate, both carrying the specific confidence of men who billed by the hour and rarely lost. The lead attorney, a narrow man named Falk, stood when it was his turn and didn't bother easing into his argument. "Ms. Hollis's operation," Falk began, addressing the board directly, "has accumulated 11 documented code violations in the past 90 days alone. Waste runoff, structural deficiencies in a barn built before current fire code, noise complaints from neighboring properties." He turned, finally, to look at Brenna directly, and something in his tone shifted into something closer to condescension.
"With respect, this isn't really a business. It's a hobby that happens to be zoned agricultural, run by someone without the capital to maintain it to code. The board should ask itself whether that's a responsible use of 40 acres of waterfront." A ripple moved through the small gallery. Brenna felt her jaw tighten, felt the old, familiar heat crawl up the back of her neck, not from the accusation about the shelter, which she could dismantle with facts alone, but from the tone underneath it. The same tone Marcus used to use when he wanted her to feel like less before an audience. "Every one of those violations was filed by an inspector Coastview hired independently, outside standard county rotation," Brenna said, standing before the board could ask her to respond. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I have the county's original inspection from March, 6 months before Coastview's interest in this land became public. 0 violations. I have my current lease, current insurance, and current permits, all of which I've submitted to this board twice already." She set copies down in front of each member without waiting to be told to. What's actually being proposed here isn't a code review. It's a company that wants waterfront property using selective enforcement to manufacture a reason to force out the one lease standing in their way. Falk smiled thinly, unbothered, already pivoting.
Regardless of intent, Ms. Hollis's financial standing remains relevant. Can she demonstrate the capital necessary to bring this facility fully to code within a reasonable time frame? Or is this board being asked to indefinitely tolerate a public nuisance because its owner is sympathetic?
The word landed exactly where he meant it to. Sympathetic. Not capable, not qualified. Sympathetic. The word men like Falk used for women they'd already decided not to take seriously. The word that made her feel, for one disorienting second, exactly as small as Marcus used to make her feel, across a dinner table in front of people whose opinions he cared about more than hers. She opened her mouth to answer, and before she could, a chair scraped back 3 rows behind her. Gideon stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Something in the room simply reorganized itself around his presence the moment he moved toward the front, the way rooms always did around him. Though this time, it wasn't fear doing the reorganizing. It was the unmistakable weight of serious money walking into a small room built for small arguments.
"Gideon Sterling,"
he said to the board by way of introduction, though 2 of the 5 members already recognized the name and sat up straighter.
"I'd like the record to reflect that as of this morning, Sterling Maritime Holdings has completed acquisition of Coastview Development's parent company, effective immediately."
The room went very still. Falk's confident expression cracked for the first time all morning.
I wasn't informed of any such transaction,"
Falk said, glancing toward his co-counsel, who looked equally blindsided.
"You weren't meant to be until it closed,"
Gideon said evenly.
"It closed at 9 this morning."
He set a folder on the table in front of the board chair. Deed transfer documents, notarized, dated, unimpeachable.
"As the new controlling entity, I'm formally withdrawing all zoning complaints filed against Ms. Hollis's lease, effective today. Further, I'm transferring full ownership of the 40 acres in question directly to the Hollis Animal Rescue Nonprofit Trust, free and clear, no conditions attached."
He turned then, not to the board, but to Brenna, and something in his expression, steady, careful, entirely without triumph, made it clear he understood exactly how precarious this moment was, how easily it could be read as exactly the kind of overreach she'd warned him against on that gravel road weeks earlier.
"This isn't a favor," he said, quietly enough that it felt meant for her alone despite the room full of witnesses. "It's a correction. This land was never Coastview's to threaten in the first place." For a long moment, Brenna said nothing at all. The board members murmured among themselves, already reaching for the transfer documents, already recalculating an outcome that had shifted entirely in the span of 90 seconds. Falk sat down heavily, whatever argument he'd had left rendered meaningless by paperwork he couldn't contest. Brenna finally looked at Gideon, and what crossed her face wasn't the gratitude he might have expected a month earlier, before he understood her at all. It was something more complicated, surprise tangled with something that looked almost like alarm, the particular expression of a woman watching the ground shift under her feet in a direction she hadn't chosen. "We need to talk," she said, low, just to him, as the board chair began reading the transfer into official record behind them. "Outside. Now." Gideon nodded once, already understanding from the set of her jaw that he hadn't finished the fight yet. He'd just moved it somewhere more private. They walked out together into the grey Portland afternoon, past Falk gathering his files with the stiff, wounded posture of a man who'd lost more than he expected to, past the small gallery still buzzing over what they'd just witnessed. Behind them,
The board formally entered the deed transfer into record, ending 3 months of threat against 40 acres of waterfront and everything living on it. Ahead of them, in the parking lot, a very different conversation was waiting to happen. Neither of them said much on the drive out of Portland. Brenna sat with her binder closed on her lap for the first time all day, staring out at the highway unspooling toward the coast, jaw tight in a way Gideon recognized from the gate confrontation weeks earlier. The specific stillness of a woman deciding exactly how angry she was entitled to be. He pulled off at a diner in Cannon Beach as the sun started sinking toward the water, a squat building with a neon sign missing its second letter, more out of instinct than plan. If she was going to say what was building behind her silence, he wanted it said somewhere with less riding on the outcome than a moving car. They sat in a booth by the window, coffee going untouched between them, waves visible past the parking lot breaking grey and steady against the sand. "You bought my land," Brenna said finally, without preamble, arms crossed on the table. "I bought a company that was threatening your land," Gideon said carefully. "The land itself went to your trust, not to me." "Semantics." Her voice stayed level, but there was real heat underneath it now, banked and controlled the way she controlled everything. "You do understand what you did in there, right? In front of a room full of people. You didn't just help me. You solved my entire problem in 90 seconds with a checkbook, the same way you'd have solved it with a threat if I'd let you back at the gate. It's the exact same move wearing a nicer suit." "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" She leaned forward. "I spent 3 months building a legal case, brick by brick, because I wanted to win this the way that let me keep something. My name on the deed, my work, my proof, my fight. And you walked in and made all of that irrelevant with one folder of paperwork you'd clearly been sitting on since before we even left the estate this morning." She shook her head, something raw showing through the anger now. "I am not a project, Gideon.
I'm not a woman you get to save because you finally found someone who didn't want anything from you, and it scared you enough to buy your way into mattering to her." The words landed harder than anything Falk had said in that boardroom, because they carried the specific accuracy of someone who'd spent years learning exactly how a certain kind of man operated and refused to let herself be fooled by it twice. Gideon sat with it for a long moment, resisting the instinct to defend himself immediately, to explain his way out of the accusation the way he would in any negotiation. This wasn't a negotiation. It deserved better than that. "You're partly right," he said, finally. "I didn't call my lawyers this morning because I sat with the decision and weighed it carefully. I called them the night after Voss tried to plant that duffel bag in your van because I couldn't stand the idea of you losing everything you'd built to men who never had to work for anything in their lives." He kept his eyes on hers, not flinching from it. "I wasn't trying to buy your affection. I want to be clear about that, because I know how it looked. I did it because I have more money than I'll ever need doing things I'm not proud of, and for once, I had the chance to use it on something that actually deserved protecting." "That's still a decision you made without asking me," Brenna said, quieter now, some of the fire banked into something more tired. "That's the part that matters, not the money. The fact that you decided what was best for my life and executed it before I even knew it was on the table." "You're right," Gideon said simply. "I should have asked. I'm sorry." She studied him across the table, searching his face for the calculation she'd learned to expect from powerful men, the angle underneath the apology. She didn't find one. What she found instead was a man who looked, for the first time since she'd met him standing rigid on his own porch weeks ago, entirely unguarded. No leverage in reserve, no fallback plan, just the plain truth sitting exposed between them. "I don't want to be someone you rescue," she said finally, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "I've spent my whole life being underestimated, and then, when someone finally noticed me, being managed instead of respected. I can't do that again, not even with you."
"Then don't let me rescue you," Gideon said. "Let me pay you back instead." Brenna raised an eyebrow, waiting. "Lease to own," he said. "Formal contract, drawn up by a lawyer of your choosing, not mine. You pay the trust back over time, at whatever terms feel fair to you, and the land is legally yours the day the last payment clears. No gift, no debt to a man who could call it in whenever he wanted. Just a loan with better intentions than a bank would ever give you." She sat with that for a long moment, turning it over, testing it for the trap she'd trained herself to look for in every generous thing a man had ever offered her. She didn't find one this time either. "Fair market interest," she said finally. "Nothing charitable about it." "Fine. And I choose the lawyer." Already agreed to that part. A ghost of a smile finally broke through, small and reluctant, but real. "You're annoyingly easy to negotiate with when you're not trying to intimidate someone." "I'm told I'm better at listening than I used to be," Gideon said. "I had a good teacher." Brenna picked up her coffee at last, finally taking a sip of something that had gone lukewarm, and looked out at the waves breaking against the darkening sand. "This doesn't mean I've forgiven the boardroom stunt entirely," she said. "You still terrified a room full of lawyers today like it was nothing. That's going to take me a minute to sit with." "Understood." "But," she glanced back at him, something warmer settling into her expression despite herself. "Nobody's ever fought for something of mine without trying to take it from me at the same time. That's new. I don't entirely know what to do with it yet." "You don't have to know yet," Gideon said. "I'm not going anywhere." Outside, the tide kept coming in against the darkening shore, steady and unbothered, the same way it had been coming in for longer than either of them had been alive, a rhythm neither of them needed to control, to trust. Voss hadn't run. That surprised nobody who knew him well, least of all Gideon. Running would have meant admitting guilt, and Marcus Voss had spent 11 years believing his own confidence hard enough that he seemed to think, even now, he could talk his way back into good standing if he just held his ground long enough. He was wrong, and by Thursday morning, everyone at the port of Astoria was about to watch him learn it. Gideon called the meeting for 7 a.m. before the terminal's regular shift began, in the long, steel-walled office overlooking the loading docks where cranes sat idle against a gray morning sky. He'd asked every senior lieutenant to attend, 12 men in total, the entire upper structure of an organization that had, until recently, run on fear dressed up as loyalty. Reyes stood near the door. Brenna wasn't there. This wasn't her fight to witness, and Gideon had been careful this time to draw that line clearly without needing her to draw it for him. Voss arrived last, exactly on time, wearing the same unbothered expression he'd worn for a decade, the look of a man who'd learned that confidence read as innocence to people who wanted to believe him. "You wanted to see me?" Voss said, taking his usual seat at the long table, as if nothing at all separated this Thursday from any other. "I wanted to see all of you," Gideon said, standing rather than sitting, a folder closed on the table in front of him. "About something that concerns the future of this organization. Marcus is just the reason we're having the conversation this week instead of next month." A ripple of unease moved through the room, the specific stillness of men who'd built careers reading which way power was about to swing before it swung. Gideon opened the folder and set 3 photographs on the table, turned so everyone could see them. Voss, half crouched at the back of Brenna's van, the duffel bag unzipped, product visible. Voss's face, caught in the porch floodlight, unmistakable. 10 days ago, Gideon said, Marcus attempted to plant unmarked product in the vehicle of a contractor working on this estate, a civilian with no ties to this business, no knowledge of its operations, and no reason to be dragged into it. Had he succeeded, it would have ended one of 2 ways:
Either she'd have been arrested for something she had nothing to do with, or this entire operation would have been exposed to a federal investigation launched off the back of an innocent woman's van. Either outcome would have cost every person in this room considerably more than whatever grievance Marcus was nursing. Voss's composure finally cracked, just at the edges. "You're taking the word of some dog trainer over 11 years of loyalty. I'm taking the word of photographic evidence," Gideon said, voice flat and final. "Time-stamped, along with 3 guards who found the abandoned bag exactly where she said it would be, and a dog who reacted to your presence the way trained animals react to threats. This isn't a matter of whose word I trust more, Marcus. It's a matter of what actually happened." Nobody at the table spoke. Voss's eyes moved around the room, searching for an ally, finding none. The particular loneliness of a man who'd spent years assuming loyalty flowed toward him, rather than earning it fresh each day. "You've gotten soft," Voss said finally, low, bitter, the mask fully gone now. "Everyone sees it. Morning walks with a rescue worker instead of running the business, letting outsiders wander the estate. You used to be someone people feared. Now you're—" He stopped himself, but the room heard the rest anyway.
"Now I'm someone who sleeps at night," Gideon said quietly, which, until recently, you'd have known was not something I could say about myself for the past 3 years. You mistook that exhaustion for strength, Marcus, the same way half this room did. It wasn't strength. It was a man running himself into the ground because he thought that was the only way to hold an organization together. He let that sit for a moment, watching several faces around the table shift, recalculating something they'd apparently been afraid to say aloud themselves. "You're removed from your position, effective immediately. Security clearance revoked. Severance paid according to your contract. Nothing more, nothing less. You have until end of day to clear your office." Voss stood, chair scraping hard against the concrete floor, some last flare of pride pushing him to his feet even now. "This organization runs on strength. You're about to find out what happens when you replace it with sentiment." "We'll see," Gideon said, unmoved. "Reyes will walk you out." He watched Voss leave, flanked but not restrained, given the dignity of walking out on his own 2 feet despite everything, and felt none of the satisfaction he might have expected a year earlier. Just a quiet, settled certainty that he'd made the right call, and made it clean. Once the door closed, Gideon turned back to the remaining 11 men, all watching him now with the particular attention people gave a leader in the moment right after he'd proven something about himself. "I know what some of you have been saying about the changes on the estate," he said. "I'm not interested in denying them. I've spent 15 years building this operation on fear. Fear of me, fear of consequences, fear keeping everyone in line because I believed that was the only currency that actually worked." He paused, choosing the next part carefully, aware it was the first time he'd said any of it aloud to the people who ran his business day to day. "I was wrong. Fear builds an organization that turns on you the moment it senses weakness, which is exactly what Marcus just proved. Trust builds something that survives a bad week." He laid out the shift plainly after that, a gradual move away from the riskier, shadier contracts that had made up a third of their revenue for years, toward clean maritime logistics, legitimate freight, the kind of business that didn't require anyone in the room to keep a duffel bag ready in case a deal went wrong. It wouldn't happen overnight. Some of the men in that room would leave rather than adjust, and Gideon had made his peace with that before the meeting even started. "This isn't sentiment," he said, closing the folder, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "It's the only version of strength that's ever actually held up under pressure. I learned that the hard way, recently, from someone who's never once needed fear to get what she wants." Nobody in the room asked who. Most of them, watching him now, steadier, clearer-eyed than he'd been in years, had already guessed. The Tillamook Valley Community Center smelled like cedar and coffee, and the particular sweetness of 100 donated desserts arranged on folding tables, strings of white lights looped across the rafters for an event that had raised, in years past, barely enough to keep the shelter's lights on through winter. This year was different. Word had spread through the valley about the land transfer, about Coastview's retreat, about a rescue that had somehow gone from fighting for survival to expanding, and the turnout showed it. Folding chairs filled 3 rows deep, a silent auction table crowded with bids, more strangers in the room than Brenna had seen at any gala in her 8 years running the place. Gideon arrived without Reyes, without a driver, without the usual careful choreography of men who moved through his world clearing space ahead of him. He wore a plain dark sweater instead of a tailored coat, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked less like the most feared man on the Oregon coast, and more like someone who'd simply shown up to support a woman he cared about. "No entourage tonight?" Brenna asked, meeting him near the door, already dressed in the same simple green dress she'd worn to the last 2 galas. No new outfit bought for the occasion, no attempt to look like anything other than exactly herself. "I figured a room full of dog people didn't need an armed escort," Gideon said. "Also, I was told very clearly by someone I respect that I needed to lose the guards eventually." "Smart man." She smiled, something easy passing between them now that hadn't been there a month earlier. The particular comfort of 2 people who'd survived enough hard conversations to trust the good ones. The evening moved warmly for the first hour. Gideon watched Brenna work the room the way she worked everything else, direct, unpolished, entirely without performance, thanking donors with real specificity instead of practiced flattery, kneeling by the silent auction table to explain exactly what a particular basket of supplies would fund. He found himself, more than once, simply watching her from across the room instead of engaging in the small talk expected of him, unable to look away from how easily she filled a space without trying to. It was near the dessert table that the evening's temperature shifted. A cluster of donors stood near the punch bowl, 2 women in expensive coats who'd written generous checks and clearly felt entitled to comment on the room in exchange. Gideon caught the tail end of it before Brenna reached earshot, low voices pitched just quiet enough to seem private and just loud enough to still be heard. "Surprising, honestly, that a woman who looks like that runs the whole operation herself. You'd think with donations this size she could afford some help. Or a decent dress. I heard she turned down a buyout worth a fortune. Can't imagine why in her position." The second woman laughed, soft and cutting, the kind of laugh that had followed Brenna through rooms like this her entire adult life. Polite cruelty dressed up as concern, the specific condescension reserved for a woman whose body didn't match the room's expectations, no matter how much good work she'd built with it. Brenna's spine straightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign she gave that she'd heard it at all. She'd built an entire life around not needing anyone's approval to keep going, and Gideon had watched her absorb worse without flinching. But something in his chest went cold and sharp anyway, the same feeling from the drive to Portland when she'd told him about Marcus. The specific fury of watching someone he loved get made small by people who'd never done a single day of the work she did. He crossed the room before he'd fully decided to. "Ladies," he said, stopping at the edge of their small circle, voice pleasant enough on the surface, but carrying an unmistakable weight underneath it, the same tone that had once cleared a boardroom in 90 seconds. "I couldn't help overhearing. I'd like to correct something, if you don't mind." Both women turned, recognition flickering across their faces as they placed him, the man whose name had circulated through Portland business circles for weeks after the Coastview acquisition made local news. Their postures shifted instantly, the practiced deference of people recalibrating around unexpected money in the room.
This entire facility, Gideon continued, gesturing toward the room around them, rescued 41 animals last year, with a fraction of the funding most operations twice its size receive. It runs debt-free because the woman standing across that room refused a corporate buyout worth considerably more than either of your donations tonight. Because she valued the work over the money.
She's rebuilt a career, a shelter, and half the trust in this county from the ground up, twice, after people who should have supported her tried to tear it down instead. He paused, letting that land, his eyes steady on both women without a trace of the charm he could have used instead. As for how she looks, I've spent time in boardrooms with the most powerful people on this coast, and I have never once been as genuinely impressed by anyone as I am by Brenna Hollis. Her intelligence, her work, her honesty, and yes, her beauty, which has never once needed your approval to be real. Silence spread outward from their small circle, rippling through the nearby tables as heads turned. Brenna, who'd caught the last half of it walking over with a fresh pot of coffee in hand, stopped a few feet away, coffee pot forgotten, staring at Gideon with an expression that had nothing guarded left in it at all. The two women, visibly flustered, mumbled something about needing to check on the auction table and retreated without finishing their punch. "You didn't have to do that," Brenna said quietly, once the room's attention had drifted back to its own conversations. "I know," Gideon said. "I wanted to. I've spent my whole life not needing a man to defend me in a room." "I'm not defending you," he said simply. "I'm telling a room full of people the truth, because apparently some of them needed to hear it out loud." He reached out, gently, and took the coffee pot from her hands before it could tip, setting it on the nearest table. "You never once tried to impress me, Brenna. Not the day we met, not once since. You just showed up exactly as yourself and let me decide whether that was enough." His voice dropped, quieter now, meant only for her despite the crowded room around them. "It was always enough. It's the only thing that's ever felt like enough." Brenna looked at him for a long moment, the noise of the gala fading into something distant and unimportant around them, and understood, with the same clear certainty she trusted in every dog she'd ever read correctly, that the man standing in front of her, powerful enough to buy a company before breakfast, and gentle enough to sit with her in a storm-lit kennel until her breathing steadied his own, saw her exactly as she was, and had chosen her anyway. 3 months later, the estate looked like a different place entirely, though nothing structural had changed except a fresh coat of paint on the kennels and a new wing added onto the barn for overflow intake. What had actually changed lived underneath the surface, in the way the whole property breathed now. Dogs sunning themselves in the yard instead of pacing it, staff moving through their days without the old tension that used to hang over everything like weather. Sterling Maritime Holdings had shed its riskier contracts one by one over those months, exactly as Gideon promised the room at the port of Astoria. Some of the old crew had left, unwilling to adjust to an operation built on legitimate freight instead of fear. The ones who'd stayed ran a business that no longer required anyone to keep a duffel bag ready in case a deal went sideways, and revenue, against every prediction Voss had made on his way out the door, had climbed rather than collapsed. Clean money, it turned out, moved just as well as dirty money once people stopped being afraid of the man behind it and started trusting him instead. Brenna's rescue had grown alongside it. The lease-to-own contract sat in a drawer in her office, payments made on schedule every month, fair market interest and all, exactly as she'd insisted. She was 3 years from owning the land outright, and she'd told Gideon more than once that those 3 years mattered to her more than any gift ever could have. Proof, written into a payment schedule, that she'd built this life herself and simply had help holding the door open along the way. The partnership agreement they'd signed the month before made it official on paper. The estate's western acreage, formerly guard dog kennels and not much else, now operated as a joint working dog training and rescue center, co-run by Brenna Hollis and funded, in part, by a maritime logistics company that had recently started sponsoring canine units up and down the coast. It was, by any measure, an unlikely arrangement. A reformed crime lord's estate turned into a sanctuary for the kind of animals nobody else wanted to fix. Neither of them had expected it to work as well as it did. On a quiet Saturday morning in late autumn, Gideon woke before his alarm, same as he had every morning for months now. Except this time, there was no anxious anticipation underneath it, no bracing for the day ahead. Just the ordinary, uncomplicated pleasure of sunlight coming through the window and Brenna's steady breathing beside him, one arm thrown over Duke, who'd taken to sleeping at the foot of their bed as though he'd earned the position through years of loyal service rather than a few dramatic nights. He made coffee, hers first, the way he'd learned to make it months ago, then his own, and carried both mugs out to the porch, where the fog was just starting to lift off the pine ridge and the ocean beyond it lay flat and silver in the early light. He sat on the top step, the same step where Brenna had once eaten a hard-boiled egg out of a paper towel, and told him, without asking permission, that his shoulders were too tense. She joined him a few minutes later, hair still loose from sleep, wrapped in one of his old jackets that had somehow migrated permanently into her rotation of clothes, despite her insisting for weeks she didn't need it. She took the mug he offered, sat down beside him on the step, and let the quiet settle over both of them the way it always did now. Not the tense, watchful silence of his old life, but something easier, something that didn't need filling. Around them, dogs stirred slowly awake in the yard, stretching in the cool morning air, padding over one by one to settle near the porch steps the way they always did at this hour, drawn less to breakfast than to the two people who'd become, without either of them planning it, the calm center of the whole property. "You're doing the thing again," Brenna said, glancing sideways at him, a small smile pulling at her mouth. "What thing?" "Staring at me like you're trying to memorize something." She sipped her coffee, unbothered, entirely at ease in a way that still occasionally struck him as extraordinary. A woman who'd spent years being told to make herself smaller, sitting on his porch in his oversized jacket with mud still under her fingernails from yesterday's work, taking up exactly as much space as she wanted to. "Maybe I am," Gideon said. He thought, sometimes, about who he'd been the morning she first drove up that gravel driveway. Exhausted, controlled, running an empire built on precision and fear because he'd never once believed there was another way to hold power without losing it. He thought about the panic attack in the kennel, about Voss's duffel bag, about the boardroom in Portland where he'd nearly cost himself everything trying to fix a problem the wrong way before learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to fix things the right way instead. Every hard turn in the last 3 months had led, somehow, to this exact quiet morning. Coffee going lukewarm in his hand, a woman beside him who'd never once tried to impress him, dogs settling around their feet like the whole estate had finally exhaled. He slept through the night now, most nights. The insomnia that had defined half his adult life had loosened its grip somewhere between the storm in the kennel and this porch, replaced by something he hadn't had words for until Brenna gave him one, months ago, on a drive up the coast. Steady. That was what she'd built into every corner of his life without seeming to try. Not by fixing him the way he'd once tried to fix her problems with a checkbook, but simply by staying, morning after morning, honest and unimpressed and entirely herself, until his whole world had recalibrated around her calm instead of his fear. He reached over and took her hand, coffee mug balanced against his knee, and she let him, leaning her head against his shoulder as the fog finished burning off the pine ridge and the ocean opened up wide and silver below them. "Good morning," he said, quietly. The same 2 words he said every day now, though they'd never once meant as much as they meant sitting here. "Good morning," Brenna said back, and closed her eyes against the early sun, entirely unafraid, exactly as she'd been the very first day she walked into his life and handed him a leash. Around them, the dogs settled into the grass. The tide kept its rhythm against the shore below. And Gideon Sterling, once the most feared man on the Oregon coast, now simply a man who'd finally learned what it meant to be healed by someone who never once tried to be anything other than herself, held on to the only thing he'd ever wanted that couldn't be bought, threatened, or controlled into staying. She stayed anyway.